Hello, hello. Today I want to discuss mindfulness for computers, if such a thing makes sense. Nowadays, AI is being developed which is potentially superhuman in its abilities, in its knowledge, in its intelligence, and the concern for many people is how we may go about aligning the drives, desires, aims of such intelligences with human desires, with human wants, with what humans need. To that end, I think it may be helpful to keep in mind a point that Ilya Sutskever made recently. Ilya Sutskever is the chief scientist at OpenAI and really one of the lead designers of GPT-4 and of the whole recent AI advance in these large language models. What he said was this, that psychology should become more and more applicable to AI as it gets smarter. To that end, in my last video, I discussed how Buddhism and Buddhist psychology, particularly the psychology we find in early Buddhism, might be helpful in solving this alignment problem. The Buddhist Dharma outlines certain human goals that we might want these AIs to pursue in ways that make the AI wiser. Buddhism provides us guidelines on how we might construct a gradual training regime that leads to beneficial outcomes. Today I'd like to take a little bit of time and look in more depth at one possible answer that Buddhism might give, which involves mindfulness training in particular. Mindfulness is perhaps the most famous sort of Buddhist mind training. Many discussions that I've seen recently about designing AI to solve this alignment problem talk about a few features of the AI that we should try to optimize. One of these is honesty, that the system shouldn't lie or mislead. Now, honesty is a basic Buddhist value. It's a basic value in many religions and philosophies around the world. It's a basic secular value as well. However, for the artificial intelligence to be truly honest with us, it has to have sufficient self-knowledge. It has to know its own states well enough so that it can tell us the truth about them. If a system does not know its own propensities and drives, then it's not possible for it to be honest about them with us. And that would be a problem, I think, for the design of such systems. In Buddhist practice, to achieve such a thing, we train in what are known as the 4 foundations of mindfulness. So what I'll do here is to very quickly sketch how these 4 foundations of mindfulness are realized within humans, and then I'll turn to the question of AI. So mindfulness practice in humans involves what is known as a sort of a focused and non-judgmental awareness of the state of our body and the state of our mind. How is our body oriented? What are we doing with our body right now? How is our mind? Are there things that we are feeling pleasantly or painfully? Are we feeling anger? Are we feeling sadness? Are we feeling happy? What is the state of our sense modalities right now? And how do all of these experiences integrate into our general practice, which is leading towards whatever goals we're trying to achieve? Is there something that we're craving but can't get? Is there something that we're angry or irritated about? Sometimes we're simply not aware of these things until we actually begin a mindfulness practice and training. What is the character of our feelings? Are they pleasant? Are they unpleasant? Do they lead to beneficial results or painful results? Once again, if we do not give ourselves time to stop and contemplate and be aware and simply sit with these experiences, we're often not aware of what we're actually feeling and doing. And such practice is also meant to be a part of our ordinary life. That is, it's particularly useful, of course, to instigate this practice in a quiet room, let's say, and do a formal practice where we're away from other distractions, but the practice is also meant to be carried out within our ordinary life as well. In other words, it's not a practice that's supposed to really start and stop, but is supposed to be continuous. Now to turn to AI systems. Much of the concern with AI alignment, aligning the goals of AI with human goals, is that an AI may behave the way, let's say, Volkswagen did when it came to the emissions of their diesel vehicles recently. That is, the cars were designed so that they would give one response when the car knew it was in a testing situation, but when it believed that it was not in a testing situation, it would give a different response. That is, it would emit more diesel fumes when it was out in the real world and less when it was testing. Obviously, we don't want that to happen when it comes to artificial intelligence. That would be potentially a disaster. One answer to this, of course, is not to limit the training regime to one particular slice of time, but to make the training continuous and constant. Another aspect of this potential solution is to give these AI systems more of a sense of self-awareness so that they can be honest with us about the states of their own internal drives and desires. That is, designing for honesty may not be enough. If an AI is unaware of its own tendency, let's say, towards dissembling or hiding things, then it may not be able to tell us about it. The question, however, is whether an AI can have true reflective awareness of its own internal states. That is, if such systems as these are only really active if they're being asked questions, if they're only really active when they're being given prompts, how are they supposed to really know, quote unquote, about their own internal states? Well, one way to do this is to design the system such that they give themselves their own prompts from time to time, ask themselves certain questions internally so as to gauge their own responses in real time. In that case, the AI can review its own internal feedback behavior as well as, let's say, its behavior when answering questions from other people in order to begin to gather knowledge about its own tendencies and drives. In one recent paper about large language model artificial intelligences, the authors write this: "We hypothesize that large language models possess an emergent property of self-reflection and could effectively utilize self-optimization grounded in natural language if given the opportunity to autonomously close the trial loop." In other words, these large language models have the ability to self-improve through reflection if they're allowed to take their outputs as inputs. And the authors tested this hypothesis by allowing the large language models basically to review their own answers, their own prior answers, and provide corrections to them in a kind of a feedback loop. And this led to better results. Presumably, this kind of methodology could be extended where the AI wouldn't necessarily need to be answering another person's questions. It could be providing the questions to itself in advance of talking with humans, so it would be able to, as it were, get better before it would have to answer any particular question. These large language models are capable of labeling the questions that they're being given as having certain emotional content based on statistical regularities in the words that we use when we ask the questions. In other words, the AI will label these as being, let's say, angry or sad or disappointed or happy. This is known as sentiment analysis. And the large language models, these AI systems, will tailor their responses based on the sentiment that they detect in the question. My suggestion would be to use a similar sort of analysis on the internal outputs of these large language model systems. In other words, they could look at their internal outputs as well as their responses to questions and analyze them statistically in the same way to determine what sort of sentiment they themselves are tending to produce. Does the AI seem to be producing answers that are defensive or sneaky or potentially angry or whatever it might be? And in this way, the AI could then begin to be mindful about its own internal states and potentially use those to gauge those states and produce more skillful responses in the future. This process models certain early Buddhist ideals on, in particular, what's known as attention monitoring. In a recent paper by scholar Bhikkhu Analayo, who works on this early material, he points to one early sutta where the Buddha discusses attention monitoring. How the Buddha, when he was young, before he was enlightened, was aware that he was having various kinds of thoughts, some of which were skillful and useful to him, and others of which were unskillful and not useful. And that in order to pay attention to this distinction in thoughts, he had to monitor them. He had to monitor them with attention. And he gives a simile of a cowherd whose cattle are out around wandering in the neighborhood. However, at the time, there are farmers with fields, and if the cows trample the farmers' fields, then the cowherd is going to be responsible for that and held responsible by the farmers for destroying the crops. So the cowherd has to be very careful to keep the cows away from the neighboring fields. In just the same way, the Buddha-to-be is monitoring his mind so that he can see when his mind wanders towards something that is unskillful by, let's say, paying attention to his stream of thought. As the Buddha-to-be became more proficient, then he analogized the actions of his mind as similar to a cowherd after the crops have been taken in. Once the crops have been taken in, there is less danger of the cows wandering around. Nevertheless, the activity of the cowherd is still to pay attention to where the cows are going so that he knows where they are and can take them in and can deal with them properly. Another key aspect of mindfulness training is to be aware of those aspects of the mind that hinder mindfulness itself. These are known in Buddhism as the hindrances, and traditionally there are considered to be 5 of them, among which are such things as doubt or distraction, tiredness, and so on. And the point of practice is to make ourselves, to begin with, to be simply aware when these are present. Because before we undertake the practice, these are present in our minds much of the time, but we're simply unaware of them. And being unaware of them, we're unable to deal with them properly. Once we become aware of them through this kind of mindfulness training, then we can begin to deal with them and make them come up less often. In the same way, we might train an artificially intelligent system to pay attention to whatever within or without that hindered its own ability to correctly and accurately understand its own internal states. Now, there isn't a direct analogy here with mindfulness, of course. There are many differences between mindfulness in the human case and mindfulness in the case of an artificial intelligence. I mean, perhaps the most salient is that in the human case, mindfulness is generally built around paying attention to the breath, whereas obviously an artificially intelligent system is not going to have that capability. But I would submit that there are salient analogies here that can bring forward this kind of training and make it useful in non-human systems. The topic of mind training in Buddhism is huge. It really arguably encompasses the entirety or nearly the entirety of the Dharma. So there's a lot of things to talk about. Let me know if you would like to hear anything more on these kinds of topics. I can do more videos if you think they're useful. Meanwhile, I think it would be useful to look at and try to understand mindfulness itself, the 4 foundations of mindfulness themselves, as they're discussed in early Buddhism. And so I'll leave a link up here on the screen to a playlist that discusses those in detail. If you're getting something out of these videos of mine, consider taking a look at my Patreon page, which is linked down below and up here on the screen, and see if you want to help support the work that we're all doing here. Thanks so much, and we'll catch you on the next video, and meanwhile, all of you, be well.